The world had gone quiet, swallowed up by the metallic scent of rain and panic. Elias, the man who commanded empires with a whisper, was on his knees. Not because of a gun, but because of a sight he hadn't prepared for. His eyes weren't on the rival syndicate closing in. They were fixed, instead, on the woman huddled in the dirt, the simple nanny he had kidnapped and treated like nothing more than a dangerous, broken toy. Her back was turned to the weak, flickering street lamp, but the outline of the scar was impossible to miss. It was long, pale, and precise, a memory etched in flesh. Elias felt the cool, heavy barrel of the enemy's gun press against the back of his neck. He didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. All the coldness, all the control he had spent his life building, shattered. He was just a boy again, trapped in a nightmare he thought he'd outrun. "Tell me," Elias whispered, the sound cracking like glass, even as the enemy pressed the trigger harder. "Where did you get that?" The nanny, bruised and shivering, turned her head just enough for the light to catch her face. Her eyes, usually so kind and worried, were now wide with an understanding that was far too old for her years. "I think," she said, her voice barely audible over the distant sirens, "it's the reason you exist." The day it all fell apart started like any other for a young woman named Serafina. Serafina was a classic beauty, but in a quiet, unassuming way. She had deep, rich, mahogany skin and hair that she usually kept braided neatly to her scalp, a practical choice for running after a demanding 4-year-old. Her eyes were her most striking feature, large, warm hazel eyes that seemed to hold a permanent look of gentle worry. Today, she wore a simple, faded denim dress, the uniform of a woman who was paid to be invisible but knew how to be essential. She wasn't a world traveler, but the job had brought her to a lavish, sprawling estate just outside of Monaco. Serafina was the nanny for the only child of a powerful European businessman. She earned barely enough to send money home to her family in Jamaica, but she loved her charge, Leo. Leo, a 4-year-old boy with bright blonde hair and the demanding, intense blue eyes of his father, was the innocent catalyst of Serafina's entire ordeal. That afternoon, Serafina was playing hide-and-seek with Leo. The house was enormous, a cold palace of marble and glass, but Leo had a secret spot he loved, a forgotten storage room down in the basement near the old wine cellar. 10, 9, 8. Serafina called out, her voice a soft melody. Leo giggled and dove behind a massive, dusty leather trunk. Serafina counted all the way down, then walked slowly toward the basement. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the storage room. The air was damp and smelled of old paper. Serafina took 3 steps in. "Ready or not, here I." She froze. Leo wasn't behind the trunk. He was standing next to a wall, his small finger pressed to a metallic panel hidden behind a hanging tapestry. A panel that was blinking a frantic, angry red light. Leo, being a curious little boy, had thought the glowing light was part of the game. "Look, Serafina," he whispered proudly. "It's sleepy." Serafina knew, instantly, that this was wrong. She wasn't a genius, but she knew security systems. That flashing red light wasn't sleepy, it was screaming. This wasn't a standard alarm. It looked like a highly sensitive sensor that was now screaming that something had been disturbed in a way it shouldn't have been. She quickly grabbed Leo and pulled him toward the door. "Good job finding it, sweetie, but we need to go back upstairs right now." Just as they stepped out of the basement, a man appeared at the top of the stairs. He was not Leo's father. This man was Elias. Elias looked like he was carved out of expensive granite. He was only in his early 30s, maybe a year or 2 older than Serafina. He had sharp, angular features, dark, intense eyebrows, and a look in his icy grey eyes that suggested he hadn't genuinely laughed in a decade. His hair was meticulously slicked back, and he wore a black tailored suit that probably cost more than Serafina made in 2 years. He moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency, like a doctor about to perform surgery, or a predator about to strike. Elias was already in a terrifying mood. The small security breach Leo had triggered, disturbing a microsensor built into the wall to detect unauthorized access to a particular section of the building, was minor, but to Elias, a minor breach meant total catastrophe was possible. His whole life was built on eliminating risk. He didn't look at Leo. He looked straight through Serafina. "What were you doing down there?" Elias's voice was low, educated, and so cold it felt like a draft had just swept through the room. Serafina clutched Leo to her chest. We were playing hide-and-seek. Leo must have knocked something. She tried to keep her voice steady. Elias took a step down, his eyes narrowing. That something, Nanny, controls the movement of millions of dollars of assets and the lives of several key people. It is not for child's play. He didn't believe her. To him, this woman, the low-paid help who was always around but rarely seen, was a liability. She was insignificant, yes, but she was now also dangerous. She had been too close to something that should have remained entirely secret. He immediately suspected she was a mole sent by a rival group to gather intelligence. Take the boy upstairs, Elias commanded his bodyguard, who had appeared right behind him, just as silent and enormous. The bodyguard gently took Leo. Leo immediately started crying, reaching back for Serafina. "Sir, don't go." Elias watched the child taken away, showing zero emotion. Then he looked at Serafina. "You," he said simply. "You're coming with me." Serafina was blindfolded and taken to a sparse, soundproof room somewhere she couldn't guess. It smelled of expensive leather and damp concrete. When the blindfold was ripped off, she squinted at the single bare light bulb overhead. Elias sat across from her at a stainless steel table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked utterly bored, which was, somehow, even more frightening than being angry. "Your name is Serafina Hayes," he stated, reciting her simple life history from a file. "Born in Kingston, Jamaica. Came to Europe 3 years ago. Student visa expired. You work for cash. Your mother needs medication. You have a sister studying back home." Serafina felt her stomach drop. All the little secrets she kept just to stay afloat were now laid out for this terrifying man to dissect. "I didn't mean to see anything," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. "It was just a light." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Tell me exactly what you touched, where you touched it, and why. Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I swear." Tears welled up in her hazel eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't going to cry for him. "We were playing in the storage room. It was dusty. I didn't even notice the panel until Leo pointed to it. It was behind a piece of cloth." Elias paused. He was trying to catch the lie, but her distress seemed genuine. He knew she was an unlikely spy. She was too exposed, too vulnerable. But she had seen something he couldn't risk her talking about, no matter how small. He couldn't just let her go. "You are disposable, Serafina," Elias told her, his tone completely flat. He wasn't trying to scare her, he was stating a fact, like saying the sky is blue. "I can make you disappear, and no one will miss you except, perhaps, your mother. Tell me what you know, and I might make it quick." Serafina finally let one tear escape, but she quickly wiped it away. She took a deep breath. She knew she had to say something to make him understand she wasn't a threat. Something only the housekeeper or a trusted aide would know. Something mundane. "The sensor," she said slowly, trying to recall the exact shape. "It's the same kind as the replacement one they put in the south parlor, just under the Persian rug. The one that kept setting off false alarms when the maid walked past it last month." The air in the room didn't just still, it froze. Elias's head lifted, his grey eyes now sharp, focused like a laser. The south parlor sensor had been a delicate, internal matter, a recent, highly discreet installation intended to monitor his associates, not just intruders. The location was known only to 3 people in his inner circle and the specialized team that installed it. It was not general household knowledge. Serafina had just said something she should not know. She had said it trying to sound innocent, but the effect was devastating. Elias's carefully constructed indifference crumbled, replaced by a deep, dangerous suspicion. Her casual mention of the false alarms and the maid implied not only awareness but deep observation of his most private security weaknesses. Who is this woman, really? Elias thought, his mind racing. She's supposed to be an insignificant nanny. He stared at Serafina, his initial dismissal of her now utterly destroyed. She wasn't disposable anymore. She was evidence. That was a chilling start, wasn't it? Elias may be ruthless, but Serafina's simple observation just changed everything. We're only getting started on this journey into a world of secrets, power, and high stakes. If you're already gripped, please do us a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the next chapter's major revelation. And let us know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. We love seeing how far this story travels. The small room where Serafina was detained felt less like a prison and more like a very expensive, very dull waiting room. It had no windows, beige walls, and only 2 pieces of furniture, the stainless steel table and 2 hard, straight-back chairs. To a woman who had spent her life learning to wait, waiting for visas, waiting for phone calls, waiting for her paycheck, it was the quiet that was the loudest threat. Serafina Hayes, the simple nanny, was trying desperately to hold on to her composure. She was still in that faded denim dress, but now she was shivering, not from cold, but from the raw, terrifying knowledge that her entire life was being held in the hands of a man who dealt in disposability. When Elias returned, he didn't bring threats or guards. He brought a single glass of water, which he slid across the table, careful not to touch her. "Drink," he ordered. Serafina studied him. He was wearing a fresh shirt under his suit jacket, perhaps changed after that tense moment downstairs. His icy grey eyes were now slightly red-rimmed, not from exhaustion, but from intense focus. His demeanor was a masterclass in stillness. Every line of his sharp, angular face suggested perfect control. "Why are you so calm?" Elias asked, settling into his chair. It wasn't a question. It was a psychological trap. What good would crying do? Serafina answered, her voice soft but steady. "You already know everything about me. You know I have nothing. If I were a spy, I would have cried the minute you took my phone. I'm just afraid of what happens next." Her honesty was unsettling. Elias was used to people panicking, screaming, or immediately trying to negotiate. Serafina just seemed resigned, yet quietly firm, like a tree bending in the wind without snapping. He didn't use threats. He used silence. He would wait 5, 10, sometimes 15 minutes, just staring at her, letting the silence stretch until it was a painful, throbbing thing in the air. "The South Parlor sensor," Elias finally spoke, breaking the quiet with surgical precision. "Describe the maid who kept setting it off." "She was short," Serafina recalled easily. "Slightly older, with grey streaks in her black hair. She was kind, always brought me tea, but she walked quickly, like she was always rushing. She used her hip to open the doors when her hands were full." Elias leaned back, studying her. This was not the description of a secret agent. This was the description of someone who pays attention to the little details of a household. "You're observant," he noted. "It's my job," Serafina replied simply. "To watch the child, I have to watch everything around him." "Did you ever have an accident in your early childhood?" Elias suddenly asked, shifting the subject dramatically. The question caught her off guard. Serafina frowned, genuinely trying to think back. I don't think so," she murmured. "I had a fever when I was very little, my mother told me. But nothing major. Nothing that caused a blank spot in your memory." Serafina looked down at her hands. The way he asked it, so confidently, made a cold little spark of recognition flicker in her mind. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly, looking up at the cold man across the table, "I have bad dreams. They're never clear. Just cold metal and a woman screaming, but the sound is muffled. I always wake up feeling like something important is missing." She shook her head, trying to clear the vague memory. "But everyone has bad dreams, right? Maybe it's just the stress of working so far from home." This was the first time Serafina gave him anything beyond the scope of the nanny job. She had been unnervingly stable until this moment. Elias, who had built his empire on erasing every trace of weakness, had spent years burying a past that gave him constant, silent nightmares. He knew what a missing memory felt like. He pressed the point, pushing her psychologically. "When you were 10, who were your best friends? What was the name of your primary school teacher?" Serafina tried to answer the questions, but the answers came back with surprising difficulty. She could name her friends from high school, but before that, The details were fuzzy. It wasn't completely blank, but there was a strange, flat quality to those early years, as if she were remembering a story told by someone else. "I remember the school building," she finally said, sounding frustrated with herself. "It was yellow stone. But the teacher's name, it's gone. Is that strange?" Elias didn't answer. He had confirmed his suspicion. Serafina was holding back, whether consciously or not. She was an anomaly. Too insignificant to be a threat, yet too observant and now, too damaged to be released. If she truly had a gap in her history, a gap that intersected with his security, she represented a time bomb. "I have 2 guards outside," Elias informed her, his decision made. "They will bring you food and water. You will stay here until I am certain you are not a problem." Serafina paled but didn't argue. She knew his decision was final. For 2 full days, Serafina remained in that boring room. She ate the tasteless food and stared at the beige walls, occasionally talking to the heavyset guard with a kind, sad face, a man named Stefan, who seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation. On the evening of the 2nd day, Elias returned. He wasn't there for an interrogation this time. He was there to observe. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching Serafina, who was sleeping curled up on the hard chair, trying to find some small comfort. He had been reviewing his strategy with Victor, his right-hand man, a tall, muscular man with close-cropped white hair and a face that never smiled. Victor had urged him to simply dispose of her. "She is nothing, Elias. A liability made of paper," Victor had advised, his voice rough. But Elias couldn't shake the memory of her quiet remark about the South Parlor censor. He had a deep, gnawing feeling that this simple nanny knew more than she realized she knew. He was looking for any physical sign of that missing piece of her history. As Elias watched her sleep, her head was tilted back slightly against the chair. Her faded dress had ridden up just a bit, exposing the line of her shoulder blade and the very top of her back. Elias saw it then. It was a mark, pale and uneven against her rich, dark skin. It was not a birthmark, but a jagged, 3-inch-long streak that seemed to dive under the fabric of her dress. It looked like the aftermath of a deep cut, or perhaps a severe burn, a thin, deliberate line. He felt a sudden, sharp, almost violent memory flash behind his eyes. Fire and metal, a sound like a hammer hitting stone, and a child crying. The memory was so quick it felt like a static shock. He frowned, rubbing his own neck, where an old tension always settled. A common injury, Elias rationalized, dismissing the internal alarm bells immediately. "She's a poor girl, she probably fell off a bike. It means nothing." He was a man who believed in evidence, not intuition. The world was full of scars. This one was just a random mark on an insignificant woman. He turned to leave the room, instructing Stefan to keep her there indefinitely. As he walked away, Stefan lowered his voice and spoke to Serafina's sleeping form. "He noticed your scar, didn't he, little flower?" Stefan whispered to himself, his own eyes heavy with unspoken history. That man may think he erased the past, but the body remembers. Serafina was tired of the beige room. After 3 days of staring at the walls, she realized her quiet resilience was starting to fray. The only movement, the only connection to the outside world, was the heavyset guard, Stefan, who brought her 3 simple meals a day. Stefan, despite his job, had a gentle manner and avoided looking directly at her, which Serafina found oddly comforting. That afternoon, Stefan brought her a tray. Serafina was sitting on the edge of the hard chair. Her old, faded denim dress was thin and worn from too many washes. As Stefan set the tray down on the metal table, she quickly stood up to help balance it, her movement stiff from sitting so long. It was a tiny, harmless movement, but it was enough. The worn fabric of her dress caught sharply on a small, unseen hook near the back corner of the stainless steel table. There was a sound like tearing paper, loud in the silent room. Serafina gasped, feeling a cold rush of air against her back. The fabric had ripped, a long, clean tear running straight down her shoulder blade, exposing the skin underneath. She immediately turned to cover herself, her face burning with shame and panic, thinking only of modesty in front of the kind guard. "I'm so sorry, miss," Stefan muttered immediately, his eyes fixed on the floor, embarrassed for her. "I'll get you a jacket." Before Stefan could move, the door flew open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Elias was back, and he was already furious. He had been nearby, watching the security feed, and had seen the flash of movement and the fabric tear. He thought Serafina was trying to grab a weapon or attack Stefan. What in God's name is happening here? Elias's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that filled the small space. His usual control was gone, replaced by an explosive intensity. He walked quickly across the room, his black suit looking even sharper against the bland walls. He stopped just a few feet away from Serafina. She was standing sideways, trying awkwardly to hold the torn denim together over her skin, her mahogany skin stark against the beige background. Elias didn't see a maid covering a tear. He saw a security incident and a vulnerable spot. He reached out with one hand, a gesture that felt less like touching and more like grabbing, and pulled her shoulder gently but firmly forward, forcing her to fully expose her back to the light. The breath left Elias's body as if he had been punched. It wasn't just a jagged line of a scar, as he had glimpsed before. The full view revealed something horrifyingly specific. The mark started at the top of her left shoulder blade as a small, pale, star-shaped burst, like a point of impact, and then trailed downward for nearly 5 inches as a thin, snaking line of puckered, shiny tissue. The whole thing looked unnatural, like a cruel geometry problem solved in flesh. It was evidence. It wasn't a bicycle accident or a cooking burn. In that instant, Serafina's gentle, worried hazel eyes looking up at him were replaced by a chaotic storm in Elias's memory. He saw the scar, and his whole world cracked open. He saw the old, cold metal of a long-abandoned industrial warehouse. He heard the deafening roar of machinery being crushed. He felt the sickening smell of smoke and oil. And he saw that exact mark, the star and the snaking line, repeated, not on skin, but on a piece of shattered glass that had rained down 20 years ago. This scar was the physical record of a devastating crime, an event that Elias had witnessed as a terrified boy. An event that he and his father, the original mob boss, had worked tirelessly to erase from every single database, document, and public record. The scar marked the precise location where a piece of shrapnel had struck a victim of the explosion. Elias's calculated control dissolved into sheer, raw panic. This woman, the insignificant nanny, wasn't a spy. She was a ghost from a past he thought was buried forever. A ghost that held the truth about the monstrous choices he had been forced to make to survive. His reaction was immediate and frighteningly disproportionate. His face, usually an unreadable mask of coldness, tightened into something grotesque, like a man whose heart had seized up. "You!" Elias roared, his voice shaking with a rage that wasn't aimed at Serafina, but at the memory she represented. "What is your father's name? Who is your family?" Serafina recoiled, terrified by the sheer force of his panic. She had never seen him lose control. His eyes were wide, and the icy grey colour seemed to flash with a frantic, internal light. "It's Hayes," she stammered, scrambling to pull the dress fabric back together. "My name is Serafina Hayes. My father died when I was very little. A construction accident back home, my mother said." Elias barely registered her words. He was mentally checking files that had been burned, files that had been scrubbed clean. He knew the name of the victim from that old tragedy, and it wasn't Hayes. But the scar was the evidence. It was an unmistakable blueprint. He didn't need to hear another word. He needed silence and isolation to think. He needed to understand how this walking piece of his buried history had ended up in his house, caring for his child. He was convinced she was sent by the rival syndicate leader who knew small pieces of this history. He spun around, facing Stefan and the other guard, Dmitri, who had silently followed him in. "Get out," Elias commanded, his voice now dangerously low and tight. "Both of you. Right now. Wait outside the door. Do not, under any circumstance, listen, or attempt to open this door again until I tell you to. Understand?" Stefan and Dmitri, sensing the lethal seriousness in their boss's tone, immediately nodded and backed out of the room. Elias walked to the door, his eyes never leaving Serafina. She was pressed against the table, shaking now, her warm hazel eyes huge with terror. Elias slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the lock with a violent click that echoed in the silent room. He stood there for a moment, his hand still on the cold metal handle, breathing heavily. He was locked in a small room with the one person who could destroy his entire life and everything he had built. He was trapped with the ghost of his past, and he didn't know what to do next. The silence that followed the heavy click of the lock was 10 times louder than the rage that had just shattered the room. Serafina was still pressed against the stainless steel table, her back turned away, clutching the torn pieces of her faded dress. Elias stood by the door, no longer the cool, surgical mob boss. His face, usually so perfectly composed with those sharp, angular features, was tight with a raw, animal fear he couldn't suppress. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or worse, realized the ghost was real. He didn't move toward her. He didn't have to. The air itself vibrated with the urgency of his unspoken question. "Turn around," Elias commanded, his voice a strained whisper, stripped of all its authority. Serafina slowly obeyed, her large, warm hazel eyes fixed on his chest, unable to meet the frantic light in his. She had no idea what she had said or done, but she knew this was about more than a breach in security. This was personal, and that was far more dangerous. "The scar," Elias finally choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward her shoulder. "Tell me everything. How did you get that mark?" Serafina flinched, instinctively lifting a hand to cover the exposed skin on her back. She had always hated that mark. It was an ugly, permanent memory of pain, and she had never shown it to anyone except her mother. "It's just an old accident," she explained, trying to sound casual, trying to make it disappear. "Nothing in my life is just an accident," Elias snapped. "Start talking, and do not lie to me. Tell me the story of the wound." Serafina took a deep breath, trying to recall a memory that felt distant and dusty. "I was maybe 5 or 6, she began, her voice soft. "I was a wild child, always running. We were living in a small wooden house in Kingston, Jamaica. Not the nice part. We had a fence with a gate that was always broken. My mother told me 50 times to be careful of the rusted metal. One day, I was racing my cousin, and I tripped." She paused, remembering the stinging antiseptic her mother had used. "I fell hard," she continued, "right onto the broken hinge of the gate. It sliced me open. My mother was furious. She said the cut looked like a star where it started, and then the rest was from the fall. The doctors stitched it up, but it got infected and left that mark." She finished the story, looking at Elias with a small, pleading sincerity in her mahogany-skinned face. "That's it. A rusty gate, a childhood tumble. Nothing more exciting than that, I promise." Serafina's explanation was simple, relatable, and utterly convincing. It was the perfect story of a working-class childhood, full of small hazards and parental warnings. And that was precisely why Elias was paralyzed with a terror he hadn't felt since he was a frightened boy. He didn't believe a single word of it. His blood ran cold because he knew, with chilling certainty, that the scar on her back had nothing to do with Jamaica or rusty fences. It had to do with Milan, Italy, and a tragedy he had paid millions to bury. He took a step toward her, his icy grey eyes wide, searching her face for any flicker of deceit. "A gate," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You tripped on a gate, and it made that precise mark." "I guess the hinge was sharp," Serafina insisted, confused by his intense reaction. Why does he care so much about a scar? Elias felt a roaring sound filling his ears. It wasn't rage anymore. It was the sound of his past life trying to claw its way out of the earth. He grabbed the back of the hard chair and squeezed the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was seeing things. Fragmented images, flashing like a broken slide projector inside his mind. A sudden, blinding orange flash. The smell of burning plastic and diesel fuel. The air shaking, not with sound, but with force, a deafening pressure. Elias saw himself, a boy of perhaps 10, small and pale, with the same slicked-back dark hair he wore now, but his eyes full of innocence, not ice. The boy was pressed against a dirty, sweating brick wall in a dark alley behind a massive industrial complex. His father, the old boss, was dragging him away, pulling him by the arm until it hurt. The boy looked back over his shoulder, drawn by the catastrophic noise. He saw the industrial press, twisted and mangled, smoking in the ruins. He saw the ground covered in sharp, metallic debris. And he saw a small figure, already still, lying near the central support column. The flashback was agonizingly quick, unreliable, and completely uncontrolled. It was a memory designed by trauma, full of gaps and contradictions. Elias couldn't remember the color of the day, or the face of the small figure. He couldn't even remember why he was there. His mind, the same mind that could run a multi-billion-dollar operation with ruthless clarity, was failing him now. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the fragmented picture back into place, to make the edges sharp and manageable. "You're wrong," Elias whispered hoarsely, talking to the memory, not to Serafina. "That didn't happen. It was erased." Serafina was now utterly convinced he was unbalanced. She watched him, terrified, as he struggled to control his own mind, his perfect posture crumbling under the strain. "Mr. Elias," she started, her voice shaking, "I don't know what you think I saw, or what this scar means to you, but I promise I'm not lying about the gate. My mother told me. It was a gate." Her insistence only fueled his panic. If she was telling the truth, if she truly believed the story about the gate, it meant that the real events were not just covered up by him, but were actively concealed from her. It meant someone had intentionally created a false history for her, planting her far away, perhaps for 2 decades, just waiting for the right moment to deploy her. Who? Who gave her a new name and a fake past? Elias walked slowly to the table, leaning his fists on the cold steel, staring down at the spot where she had been sitting. His mind went back to the specific event. The collapse of an old factory during a targeted explosion meant to eliminate a threat to his father. The explosion had gone wrong, causing massive collateral damage. There were 3 casualties, all officially listed as missing, all scrubbed from public records by his father's team. He forced himself to recall the layout of the factory floor, the structural diagram of the central support. He pictured the blast pattern, the way the debris had flown. He specifically recalled the shattered window near the column. The window had been hit by a piece of steel rod. The rod had then shattered the thick glass, sending a starburst pattern of shrapnel toward the victim. Elias straightened up, his face losing all color. He looked across the room at Serafina, who was still guarding her back. He saw the pale, star-shaped burst on her shoulder blade, and the thin, snaking line of the wound trailing downward. He didn't just recognize a scar. He recognized the signature of the accident. The star was the precise impact point of a specific, high-velocity piece of metal shrapnel, and the thin line was the way the force of the blast had dragged the remaining debris across the victim's back before they were fully shielded. It was the exact, horrifying pattern created by the incident that night in Milan. Serafina Hayes was not just someone with a scar. She was the one survivor who should have died 20 years ago. The central pillar of his entire empire was built on a lie, and the evidence was standing right in front of him. She is the one. Elias slowly raised his hand and pointed, not at her, but at the empty space behind her. His eyes were burning with realization and absolute dread. "That," he stated, his voice now nothing more than a ragged sound. "That mark is not from a gate. That mark is from the Milan incident." Elias was frozen, his hand still gripping the doorknob. The sheer force of his realization had driven every other thought, security, the guards outside, the millions of dollars at risk, completely out of his head. All that mattered was the impossible fact standing across the room. Serafina was a survivor of a moment that had destroyed his own childhood and built his terrible adulthood. Serafina was sobbing now, quiet, desperate tears sliding down her mahogany skin. "What are you talking about?" she pleaded. "Milan. I've never been to Milan. I was a child in Kingston when I got this cut. You're making this up to scare me." Elias finally released the door, stepping back into the center of the room. He didn't look intimidating anymore. He looked haunted. "No," he said, his voice flat with horror. "You don't understand. I know how you got that scar because I was there when it happened." And in that small, silent room, for the first time in 20 years, Elias let the truth out. He didn't tell Serafina, he was telling himself, walking her through the nightmare he had been running from his whole life. It was not a gate. It was not an accident. It was the Milan incident. It was a war. The night in Milan. Elias, back then, was just a 10-year-old boy, terrified and utterly helpless. His father, the powerful boss of the Italian family, was engaged in a brutal fight over control of the docks and the shipping routes. The night of the incident was supposed to be a surgical move, a targeted raid. They were going after the leader of the rival group, a powerful man who owned a small metal fabrication factory. Elias was dragged along by his father's men, hidden in a black van, meant to learn the business of elimination. The plan was simple: set a small fire in the office wing to draw out the leader, then capture him. But there was a betrayal. One of Elias's father's most trusted men, a man he considered an uncle, had tipped off the rivals. When the small fire started, the rivals weren't running out, they were waiting inside. They had rigged the huge factory, the massive building full of silent, cold machinery, to come down on itself. When Elias's father and his men rushed in, trying to escape the ambush, the whole back wall was triggered to collapse. The sound was like God breaking the world, Elias narrated, his icy grey eyes staring blankly at the wall, seeing only the explosion. Elias was dragged clear by his father just as the main building started to crumble. They were pushed into a narrow alleyway, hiding behind a mountain of old, smashed barrels. He remembered the heat, the roar, and the way the air tasted of burning oil and copper. Through the smoke, he watched as a torrent of metal and glass rained down like a deadly storm. And then, he saw her. Just before the massive hydraulic press machine crumpled into itself, crushing the central support column, he saw a small figure. A little girl, perhaps the same age as him, maybe a little younger. She was huddled by the concrete pillar, trying desperately to shelter herself. She was not the target. She was the innocent child of a low-level worker who happened to be staying late that night. Elias saw the debris field, the massive piece of steel shrapnel that struck the window near her. He saw the resulting fragments of thick glass and metal dust rain down on her small body. He specifically saw her scream once, a silent, choked sound, before the main weight of the destruction consumed the spot where she lay. "My father grabbed me and ran," Elias recounted, his voice hoarse. "He told me to shut my eyes, forget what I saw, and never speak of it. He left her there." The child was assumed dead, destroyed by the collapse. The collateral damage was too great, the risk of exposure too high. Elias's father paid an astronomical amount of money to bribe the local police, fire department, and city officials. The official story was a massive, accidental industrial explosion. The 3 casualties, 2 low-level workers and the girl, were officially declared missing, presumed deceased, their names wiped clean from all public databases. That night changed everything for Elias. He was 10 years old, forced to watch pure innocence destroyed by his family's violence, and forced to keep silent about it. His father taught him that sentiment was weakness. To survive, Elias had to kill the boy he was and become the ruthless, cold, surgically precise man he is now. "I built my empire on that concrete grave," Elias confessed, the guilt finally bubbling to the surface. "I became ruthless to make sure no one could ever use that knowledge against me. I eliminated every weakness, every file, every name." And yet, here was Serafina. Mahogany skin, hazel eyes, quiet composure, and a scar that was a perfect, photographic match of the destruction. Elias walked slowly around the table, his eyes now fixed on her shoulder, tracing the star-shaped burst and the thin, snaking line. He had dismissed her as an insignificant nanny. He had dismissed the scar as a rusty gate accident. But the true story, the story Serafina didn't even know, was screaming at him. He was silent for a long moment, allowing the weight of the past 2 decades to crash down on him. "When my father's people cleaned the scene," Elias finally revealed, his voice steadying with a cold, terrifying understanding, "they recovered the bodies of the 2 adults. They identified them and paid them to disappear. They found debris, metal, and blood, but they never found the 3rd body." Serafina blinked, her breathing hitching in her chest. "The 3rd body." "The child," Elias confirmed, his icy grey eyes now drilling into her. "The girl. The one who suffered the blast right near the column. She was never recovered. The file was closed with 3 presumed dead, but no body. No bones. No positive confirmation." He stepped closer, close enough for Serafina to smell the expensive cologne and the metallic scent of fear coming off him. You said your father died in a construction accident, Elias stated. And your mother told you the gate story. He reached out a single finger, tracing the cold, raised tissue of the scar. Serafina flinched violently at the touch. Serafina, Elias whispered. The simple name now loaded with 20 years of buried secrets. If you were the child in that fire, the only way you could have survived, the only way you could have been taken to Kingston and given a new identity, is if someone else, a third party, a traitor, was waiting to rescue you. He dropped his hand, the realization hanging in the air like smoke. The girl was never confirmed dead, Elias concluded, the truth a sharp blade aimed right at his heart. She was missing, and now, 20 years later, I think I just found her. Elias's panic had solidified into a chilling, laser-like focus. He had just connected the small, insignificant nanny to the most catastrophic secret of his life. Serafina was no longer a liability. She was the key to his entire identity, or the bomb that would destroy it. He quickly unlocked the door and threw it open, startling the two guards, Stefan and Dimitri. Victor. Elias barked into his phone, his voice tight. Cancel every meeting. Clear my schedule. I need every internal document concerning the Milan incident, the original casualty report, the missing persons file, and every name involved in the cleanup and subsequent payout. Now. And pull every financial record and every piece of official documentation related to Serafina Hayes. He turned back to Serafina, who was still trembling, the truth of his revelation washing over her. She realized the mundane story her mother had told her about a rusty gate was a desperate cover-up. She hadn't been in an accident. She had been in a disaster. I don't understand, Serafina whispered, tears streaming down her mahogany skin. If I was in that fire, why would my mother lie to me? Why Kingston? Because someone saved you, gave you a new life, and buried you where my father would never look, Elias explained, though he was still piecing it together himself. His tone was strangely devoid of anger now, replaced by the grim calculation of a man facing a terrible truth. For the next 4 hours, Elias remained in the room, but he wasn't talking to Serafina. He was working. Victor, his right-hand man with the close-cropped white hair, brought a laptop and a secure satellite phone, setting up a makeshift command center on the cold metal table. Elias began ripping through 20 years of records, files secured behind multiple encryption layers. He was tracing Serafina's life backwards, from the moment she crossed the European border to the moment she was registered in Jamaica. The adoption records came first. Serafina's stated mother, Aisha Hayes, was a real person, a kind, hard-working woman who worked multiple jobs in Kingston. Elias's team cross-referenced the adoption papers with the Italian incident reports. The name, Elias, Victor announced grimly, scrolling through data. The original missing girl was not Serafina Hayes. The missing child's name was Elena Rossi. Serafina let out a small, choked sound. The name felt like a foreign body in her mouth. Elena Rossi. It meant nothing to her, yet it felt heavy, final. Elena Rossi, Elias repeated, the name tasting like cold metal. Daughter of Marco Rossi, the factory foreman, who was also declared missing. Marco was known to be anti-syndicate, trying to organize the workers against the boss's control of the dock. The financial records confirmed the lie. There was a single, large payment made to Aisha Hayes in Jamaica 20 years ago, just after the Milan incident. The transfer came through a complex series of shell companies in Switzerland, masked by a man who was now long dead, a former associate of Elias's father. The adoption papers are flawlessly executed, Victor observed, his eyes wide. The signatures are perfect. Birth certificate is legitimate. The name Serafina Hayes is legally and officially her identity. They didn't just create an identity, Victor, Elias corrected, his gaze fixed on Serafina's terrified hazel eyes. They created an entire life. They raised her, protected her, and gave her a mundane story about a rusty gate. They did this to keep her from ever knowing she was Elena Rossi, the daughter of a man who fought us. Serafina was completely overwhelmed. The name she had lived with, the family history she had cherished, was a lie. Her quiet, hard-working mother had taken a huge risk and a life-changing sum of money to raise a ghost. This means the trauma she suffered, the lack of memory, the muffled screams in her nightmares, is real, Elias deduced. She was never told the truth to protect the new identity. She is not a spy. She is a victim who was hidden. The third player. Elias took a moment, looking at Serafina. She was fragile, completely exposed, standing on the wreckage of her own life story. He had spent his life believing he was the only one haunted by the Milan incident, but Serafina was literally marked by it. We need to find who paid for the adoption, Elias ordered Victor. Who controlled that Swiss shell corporation 20 years ago? Victor worked quickly, but the trail was cold. The man who had managed the transfer had died 5 years later. However, Victor found something else. Elias, Victor said, his voice dropping, I found a recent inquiry into the Serafina Hayes identity. About 6 months ago. Someone was actively searching for her. Elias leaned over the laptop screen, his angular features tightening. Who? The query originated from a low-profile offshore consulting firm in Malta, Victor explained. But the firm is known to be a front. It's owned by Silas Kresnik. Silas Kresnik. The name hit the room like a gunshot. Kresnik was the leader of the rival syndicate, the secondary antagonist, a man who ran a powerful Eastern European network. Kresnik had been a minor associate of Elias's father 20 years ago. A man who always knew some secrets but never enough to be truly dangerous. Until now. Kresnik knew about the Milan incident, Elias muttered. He always hinted at it. But he never knew the child survived. He only thought there was an unaccounted body. He knows now, Victor corrected grimly, pointing to the screen. The search was active. He was looking for Serafina Hayes, knowing she was the survivor, the key to the Milan incident. He didn't just know pieces of the past, he knew the living evidence existed. Elias stood up, running a hand over his slicked-back hair. The situation had just shifted from an internal problem to a global crisis. Kresnik had been searching for Elena Rossi, alias Serafina Hayes. The moment Elias had kidnapped her, Kresnik would know she was found. The rival leader didn't want the girl for vengeance, he wanted her to weaponize her scar, the evidence that Elias's powerful family built their empire on murder and lies. Kresnik would use her to destroy Elias's organization from the inside out, exposing him to every authority and rival in Europe. Elias looked at Serafina, the girl who was now Elena, the ghost of his past, sitting terrified on a hard metal chair. She was worth nothing to the world, but everything to him. Victor, Elias commanded, his voice cold and final. Kresnik knows she's here. He knows she's the evidence. We're moving her now. Seal the entire building. No one leaves. No one enters. He stared at the distraught woman. His past had finally caught up to him, not in a bullet, but in a small, pale scar. He wants you, Elena, Elias whispered, using the name that felt both true and utterly alien. And now that he knows you're alive, he will tear this city apart to get you. The tiny interrogation room, which had been a symbol of Elias's absolute control, now felt like a very small cage. He had just discovered his most dangerous enemy, Silas Kresnik, was hunting the woman standing 3 feet away from him. A woman he now knew as Elena Rossi, the ghost of his darkest memory. Elias was a man who commanded armies of lawyers and security details. A man who could change the direction of global markets with a single phone call. Yet, facing Elena and the stark reality of the pale, star-shaped scar on her back, all his power meant absolutely nothing. He couldn't buy his way out of this truth. He looked at Serafina, Elena, who was huddled against the wall, her chin trembling, her warm hazel eyes clouded with shock and disbelief. Her life was an illusion, created by violence and lies. He was the architect of the continuing silence, and she was the living consequence. I was wrong about you, Elias admitted, his voice rough. He wasn't apologizing. He was simply stating the final audit of his mistake. I thought you were a spy. But you're just a victim of the same mistake I was forced to cover up. Elena shook her head slowly, clutching her arms to herself. Mistake. My life is a mistake. My mother, Aisha, she is the only mother I've ever known. She lied to me for 20 years about everything. Was she paid to do that? Was she part of your syndicate? Elias walked slowly to the table, leaning against it heavily. He had always kept his emotions locked deep beneath the surface, but now the walls were cracking. The pain of the past was flooding in. He decided to tell her what he knew, using simple terms that showed her she wasn't alone in the wreckage of that night. Your birth father, Marco Rossi, was a good man, Elias confessed, his voice low. He worked at that factory. He was trying to get the workers to stand up to my father's demands. That night, my father ordered a raid, a show of force to make him stop. He stopped, struggling to breathe around the memory. The fire was just supposed to be a threat. But the rivalry was deeper than we knew. Someone, one of his enemies, had rigged the whole place to collapse, Elias explained, simplifying the complex sabotage. The goal was to make it look like an industrial accident that took out both sides. My father was desperate. He pulled me out, saved my life, but he couldn't go back for anyone else. Not you. He wiped the existence of everyone involved to protect his family and the empire. Elias looked straight at her. I know this isn't easy to hear, Elena. But I was just a terrified boy who saw his father do a terrible, terrible thing. I didn't cause the collapse, but I covered the lie. I built my entire future on the belief that everyone from that night was gone. That there was no proof left. He was confessing, but he was confessing the sins of the past, the original crime. He omitted the part where he ruthlessly took over the business, eliminating rivals without a second thought. He needed her to see him as a fellow victim of the truth, not the powerful monster he had become. Elena listened, her body still shaking, but the tears finally stopped. Her fear was hardening into a quiet, cold comprehension. The terror she had felt earlier was replaced by a massive, hollow grief for the life she thought was hers. You left me to die, she stated flatly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. My father left you, Elias corrected quickly, unable to tolerate the full weight of the blame. But yes, we left you. We assumed you were buried under the wreckage. The realization hit Elias then, harder than any physical blow. His empire, his wealth, his control, it was all meaningless. He was a billionaire standing in front of a woman whose simple life was destroyed by his family's violence, and now he was terrified of his enemy finding her. My power, Elena, Elias said, his voice laced with self-contempt. It can control global shipping. It can intimidate governments. But it cannot fix that scar. It cannot give you back the 20 years of truth my family stole from you. He felt a deep, profound sense of helplessness. His usual solution, eliminate the threat, was impossible. He couldn't eliminate Elena. She was the truth, and she was tied inextricably to him. He knew she wouldn't trust him. He wouldn't trust him. But he had to protect her from Kresnik, who would weaponize her without a second thought. I have to keep you safe, Elias insisted. Kresnik knows the only way to destroy me is through you. We have to move you right now, or you won't survive the hour. And if I leave with you, what is my life then? Elena challenged, finding her voice, her mahogany skin now taut with resolve. Another lie. Another basement. I don't know if I'm Serafina or Elena, but I know I'm not a bargaining chip. Elias couldn't look at her. She was right. He had taken her life, and now he was demanding control over her survival. Elias realized he needed to set up the immediate logistics for their escape. He pulled out the secure phone and stepped just a few feet away, turning his back to Elena, assuming her state of shock would render her oblivious. He spoke low, to Victor, who was waiting anxiously on the other end of the line. Victor, the security sweep on the outside entrance. Did you find anything about the timing of the original betrayal? The man who set the factory to collapse? Elias asked. Elena, despite her emotional exhaustion, was focused on one thing: survival. She was intensely observant. It was the trait of the nanny, the trait that had gotten her into this mess. She stilled her breathing and listened. That's still a deep black hole, Elias, Victor replied over the secure line, his voice metallic and strained. The records are gone. The only lead is a former associate who handled the final cleanup of the area. He might know who was waiting to pick up the survivors, if there were any. Elias pressed his forehead against the cool wall. Find that man. Dimitri Stavros. If he knows who paid Aisha Hayes, Here's the link to Kresnik. Here's also the risk. He paused, then delivered the command that Elena heard perfectly, cold and chilling, even through the muffled connection. Dmitri Stavros knows the whole truth. If Kresnik reaches him first, we are finished. Victor, I don't care how you do it. Find Stavros, but do not let him speak to anyone else. Is that clear? Elena's heart pounded against her ribs. Elias wasn't just afraid of Kresnik. He was actively moving to silence a witness. This wasn't about seeking justice for Elena Rossi. This was about protecting the monster he had become by erasing people. She closed her eyes, recognizing the cold, lethal logic behind the command. Elias was not a victim, he was a boss. And to him, the truth, once again, was just another thing that needed to be silenced forever. She had been right. She was not a bargaining chip. She was the one thing he desperately needed to hide. Elena stood paralyzed as the door clicked shut behind Elias. The cold instruction she had just heard, "Do not let him speak to anyone else," echoed in the silent room. Elias wasn't just a powerful man protecting himself. He was actively preparing to execute a man named Dmitri Stavros to keep his secret safe. The difference between the panicked boy in his memory and the cold predator on the phone was now clear. When Elias turned back around, his eyes, those sharp, icy grey eyes, were still fixed on his immediate problem, logistics and escape. He saw Elena as baggage, necessary evidence to be protected. "We're leaving now," Elias stated, moving toward her. "I have a team prepping an armored car. Kresnik will be here within the hour. You need to gather your wits and follow my instructions without question." Elena didn't move. She felt a surge of strength, not from physical power, but from moral outrage. She was no longer the frightened nanny. She was Elena Rossi, the forgotten consequence of his violence. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, considering the chaos inside her. Elias stopped instantly, annoyed by the unexpected resistance. "This is not a negotiation, Elena. This is survival." "You just ordered someone killed," she stated. "A man named Stavros. A man who knows the truth. You want to silence the witnesses to protect the boss. You're doing the same thing your father did." The accusation hit him hard. His perfect control wavered. Stavros is a liability. He's a dirty associate who will sell you to Kresnik for 2 coins. "I'm protecting you. You're protecting your empire." Elena challenged, moving slowly toward the table, her mahogany skin pale with conviction. "I'm not moving until you stop talking about armored cars and logistics and tell me the whole truth about this scar. Not the story you told yourself for 20 years, but the real story. What exactly happened to me that night?" Elias hesitated. He had already confessed the high-level details, the fire, the betrayal, the survival. But he had never allowed himself to relive the specifics. It was the last, most defended wall in his mind. "It was a collapse," Elias spit out. "Debris hit you. You were a casualty." "Casualty of what?" Elena insisted, pointing a trembling finger at the precise mark on her left shoulder. "You recognized this mark instantly. You didn't see a vague cut. You saw a pattern. Show me. Show me the picture in your head." For Elias, the confrontation was unbearable. He realized that this was the moment of reckoning. He had to face the horror he had buried, or she would never move. He had to dismantle the protective mechanism of his own mind. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and then he began to speak, his voice turning clinical, like a scientist forced to describe a monstrous exhibit. "The factory floor," Elias started, his eyes now open, fixed on the ceiling, describing the scene for the first time in full detail. It was mostly sheet metal presses. Near the central pillar, there was a window, thick, industrial-grade glass. The internal saboteur had placed the final charge at the base of the main support column. He walked slowly, using the beige walls and the metal table as props, sketching the scene with his hands. When the charge detonated, the building didn't just fall, it imploded. A thick steel rod, part of the main pulley system, was thrown outward by the force, striking the window near the column at high velocity. Elias stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at Serafina's shoulder. The force of the impact created a starburst fracture in the thick glass, he explained, pointing to the top of her scar. The starburst was the point of entry. It sent thousands of small, aerodynamic glass pieces flying outward. The initial wound, that star-shaped burst on your shoulder blade, that was the primary impact of a high-velocity glass shard. It stopped you completely. He paused, then traced the snaking line of the scar below the star. The column was buckling, he continued, his voice losing its control. The ground was shifting. You fell. And as you fell, the remaining, less aerodynamic pieces of shattered window and metal dust were scraped across your back as the building shielded you from the rest of the collapse. That is the snaking line. The specific curve matches the debris trail near that pillar. It's the signature of the blast. Elias finished, his face glistening with cold sweat. He had reenacted the moment of her trauma in perfect, technical detail. He hadn't just covered up a death, he had memorialized the exact way she was injured. He was the only person alive who understood the map of her scar. The detailed confession broke him. It was one thing to carry the guilt of an ambiguous mistake, it was another to realize he had spent 20 years running from the geometry of a child's injury. The powerful boss, the man who never showed weakness, suddenly had nowhere left to hide from the boy who had seen it all. He looked at Elena, and he saw not a strategic threat, but a small, brave child trying to shelter herself from a catastrophe his family started. He saw a life stolen, a mother bribed, and a truth erased. He saw the cold, brutal foundation of his entire life's work. Elias, the unfeeling controller, didn't sink to his knees dramatically. He simply lost the muscular tension that held him upright. His knees hit the cold concrete floor with a dull, sickening thud. He didn't cry out. He didn't cover his face. He simply stared at the floor, his slicked-back hair hanging down, completely still in an attitude of profound, agonizing shame. His collapse was earned. It wasn't melodrama. It was the physical surrender of a man who realized his absolute power could not fix the one thing that defined him, his original sin. "I was there," Elias whispered, his voice catching in his throat, the sound raw and broken. "I saw you fall. And I didn't say anything. I let them lie. I let you disappear. I chose power over you." Elena watched him, her own fear momentarily forgotten. The man who had been terrifying her for days was reduced to a broken figure, undone by a piece of truth she didn't even know she possessed. Elias finally pushed himself up onto his knees, looking up at Elena. His eyes held a stark, desperate plea. "Elena, listen to me," he said, the power of command now replaced by the urgency of a desperate man. "Kresnik wants you. He knows you're the key. He will not care about the scar. He will only care about the evidence. If he finds you, he will expose me, and I will fall, but you will be killed as a loose end." He reached a hand toward her, but stopped short of touching her. "I need to get you out of here," Elias insisted. "I can give you a real identity this time. A new life. A new country, Canada, perhaps. Safety, money, protection. You can disappear forever, and Kresnik will never find you. You can have peace." He lowered his head, acknowledging the horror of the alternative. "Or," Elias continued, his voice tight, "you can use the scar. You can expose me. You can give your testimony, bring down my empire, and find justice for your father. But if you do that, you will be hunted by every rival organization I have ever made an enemy of. You will die before the sun sets." Elena looked down at the most feared man in Europe, who was kneeling before her, offering her a future of forced peace or guaranteed violence. She knew what she had to do. The Elena Rossi in her demanded justice for her father and for the quiet lie she had been forced to live. The Serafina Hayes in her, the nanny who cared for little Leo, demanded the simple safety she had never had. She looked at Elias, the physical embodiment of her trauma, and realized she was holding the fate of two lives, her own and his, in her hands. "If I disappear, Elias," Elena said, her voice clear and decisive, "I will never know who put me in that house. Who paid Aisha Hayes? Who was the third person on that night in Milan who risked everything to save me? Who gave me my false life?" She looked around the room, making her final decision. The door was locked. It was just the two of them. You have to choose, Elias, she whispered. Safety or the truth? Which one do we pursue? Elias remained on his knees, his head bowed, waiting for the decision. He was offering Elena a gilded cage in Canada, a perfect disguise and safety. He knew she deserved justice, but the moment she sought it, the chaos would consume them both. Elena, however, saw past the powerful facade. The man on the floor was not the marble sculpture of the boss. He was just a broken man haunted by the truth. She looked down at him, her mahogany skin glowing faintly in the dim light, and she spoke to the man, not the monster. My mother, Aisha, she taught me that when a fire burns down a forest, you don't worry about the smoke, Elena said softly. You worry about the roots. The scar on my back, Elias, that's just the smoke. The roots are who decided to save me. She moved away from the table, facing him directly. You're telling me that someone risked their life to pull me out of that collapsed factory, paid my adoptive mother a fortune, and set up a perfect fake life for me in the Caribbean, Elena continued. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a conscious choice made by a compassionate person who worked alongside your father. You only care about silencing that person. I want to meet them. Elias finally raised his head, his icy grey eyes reflecting a painful understanding. She was demanding the truth behind the betrayal that had saved her life. She was demanding the identity of the traitor. You want the name of the man who risked everything to expose my father? Elias asked, his voice raw. I want the name of the man who saved me, Elena corrected firmly. The person who gave me a life, even a borrowed one. If I choose to disappear, I will always be running from that truth. If I choose justice, I will expose you, and Kresnik will destroy us both. We need a third option. Elias stood up slowly, the shame settling back into the rigid lines of his body, forcing him to reclaim his control. He realized Elena was right. Disappearing now would only mean Kresnik would use the child, Leo, to draw her out. The thought of Leo, his 4-year-old son with the demanding blue eyes, immediately made Elias's calculus shift. Leo adored Serafina. She was a genuine, essential comfort in his cold, chaotic life. The child, Elias admitted, running a hand through his dark, slicked-back hair. Leo. Kresnik already knows the nanny disappeared from my house. If you vanish, he'll go after Leo as leverage. The emotional weight of the empire, the truth, and the innocent child collided violently. Elias realized he couldn't protect anything by being selfish. He couldn't hide the truth, and he couldn't let Leo become a pawn. The man who handled the money transfer and the adoption papers, the man who would know the identity of the savior, is Dimitri Stavros, Elias confessed. The man I just ordered Victor to silence. He pulled out the secure phone. This was the moment of his own moral reckoning. He had to stop the execution order. Victor, Elias said into the phone, his voice steadying, stand down. I need Stavros alive. I need him brought here, secured, and ready to talk. Tell your team this is a change of mission. We are protecting him from Kresnik. He hung up, looking at Elena. That's your choice, Elena. We find Stavros. We find the person who saved you. And then we confront Kresnik with a truth he can't weaponize. Elena nodded, her warm hazel eyes finally showing a flicker of hope amidst the fear. Good. Now we run. Elias moved fast. He told Elena to change into clean, anonymous clothes that Victor had left outside, a simple black tracksuit that would help her blend into the night. Just as they were preparing to leave the basement room, a different kind of sound sliced through the silence of the guarded building. It wasn't the sound of an alarm, it was the sound of a single, muffled gunshot from somewhere on the main floor. Elias's head snapped up. That's not Kresnik's team, he muttered, his hand instantly reaching inside his jacket for the concealed weapon he always carried. Kresnik would use explosives to draw attention. That was an inside job. He looked at Elena, his face grim. Someone in my inner circle just betrayed me. He was right. It was Victor. Victor, Elias's intensely loyal right-hand man with the close-cropped white hair, was loyal not to Elias, but to the power and ruthlessness of the position. He had listened to Elias's panicked confession, witnessed the boss kneeling, and watched him prioritize a victim's truth over the empire's stability. For Victor, that was weakness, the very thing Elias was supposed to have eliminated. Victor knew if Elias brought Stavros in alive, the whole story of the Milan incident, the story that built their wealth, would collapse. So, Victor had acted first. The single gunshot had been aimed at Stefan, the heavy-set, kind-faced guard who was trying to stop Victor's unauthorized movements. Victor had neutralized the loyalists and was now coming for Elias and Elena. "He thought I was weak," Elias whispered, realizing the depth of the betrayal. "He's coming to silence the truth before it leaves this building." Elias grabbed Elena's hand. "We're going through the maintenance tunnels. Stay close." They moved quickly out of the interrogation room. Elias pulled open a heavy metal access panel hidden behind a utility cabinet, revealing a narrow, dusty tunnel leading into the cold structure of the building. Just as Elena squeezed into the darkness, they heard heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the basement corridor. "Elias, don't be a fool." Victor's voice boomed down the corridor, cold and full of disappointment. "The girl is a relic. She must be eliminated for the stability of the organization. I'm saving you from yourself." Elias shoved Elena forward into the dark tunnel. He turned, facing the corridor just as Victor's powerful figure rounded the corner, flanked by two other loyal, heavily armed guards. "Victor, you were like a brother." Elias shouted, leveling his gun. "I am loyal to the crown, Elias," Victor replied, raising his own weapon. "Not the man who wears it weakly." A sudden, rapid burst of gunfire erupted. The metallic ringing deafened Elena inside the tunnel. She scrambled forward, choking on the dust, but she couldn't see if Elias was hit. She could only hear the heavy thud of a body falling to the concrete floor. Blood was spilled. The sound of the gunfire in the corridor was sharp and quick, followed by a heavy, sickening thud. Elena froze inside the narrow, dusty maintenance tunnel. Her breath hitched, filling her lungs with the stale smell of concrete and oil. She couldn't tell who had fallen. Was it the terrifying boss, Elias, who had just dropped his mask of power? Or was it the monstrous Victor, the right-hand man who had betrayed them both? Elena didn't wait to find out. She was tired of being the passive victim. She turned and scrambled back through the tight space toward the entrance. She found Elias slumped against the cold metal casing of the utility cabinet. His face, usually so perfectly controlled with those sharp, angular features, was contorted with pain and shock. He wasn't bleeding heavily, but a dark patch of red was rapidly blooming on the shoulder of his tailored black suit jacket. He had managed to take down the two guards with Victor, but the right-hand man himself was nowhere in sight. Victor had retreated, wounded but alive, to regroup. "He got me," Elias whispered, his voice weak. "Just a graze. But my arm is useless." Elena quickly assessed the situation. Elias's gun was still clutched in his left hand, uselessly. His right arm, the wounded one, was dangling at an awkward angle. The terrifying man who could command an army of thugs and lawyers was now injured, bleeding, and entirely dependent on the insignificant nanny he had kidnapped days ago. The shift in power was absolute and immediate. "We don't have time," Elena said, her voice now calm and decisive. Her fear had been replaced by the fierce clarity of necessity. She tore a strip of fabric from the discarded sleeve of her old denim dress and quickly fashioned a crude pressure wrap around his upper arm, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "You're going to walk," she instructed, her warm hazel eyes focused entirely on the wound. "We need to get deeper into the tunnels before Victor can seal the access points." Elias, for the first time in his life, simply obeyed. He was too weak, too shocked by the internal betrayal, to argue. He let Elena guide him, his body heavy and useless, through the narrow, dark passages. As they moved through the damp, airless tunnels, the hidden veins of the massive estate, Elias's mind was reeling. Victor, the man he trusted to guard his secrets, had turned on him the moment he showed humanity. "He thought I was soft," Elias muttered, leaning heavily on Elena as they navigated a tight corner. He saw the collapse, the shame, and he thought it was the end of the line. He's loyal to the Empire, not the man. "Then the Empire is built on rot," Elena said simply. She wasn't judging him. She was stating the final audit of his life. This forced dependence was a brutal reckoning for Elias. His entire existence was defined by control, wealth, and the ability to eliminate threats before they materialized. Now, his survival depended on the emotional resilience and physical strength of a woman whose only power came from caring for a child. In that dark tunnel, Elias realized his power had been a lie. "I built this life on a foundation of silence," Elias confessed, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "I thought money could erase the stain of the Milan incident. But the stain didn't go away. It grew into Victor. It grew into Kresnik. It grew into the rot that almost killed me tonight." Elena stopped, pushing him gently against the wall to rest. "It was never about the money, Elias. It was about what you were willing to give up to keep it. You sacrificed the truth, and that is why you lost control." She looked at him, her rich, mahogany skin barely visible in the dark. "My strength wasn't in my innocence. It was in my observation. I watched your son, Leo, and I saw that all he needed was stability, not armor. Your power is useless here. My strength is what keeps us alive." She had redefined his world with a single statement. Power was not in the gun, it was in the truth, and the ability to choose empathy over elimination. For the first time, Elias felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. He was losing everything, but he was finally becoming human. They emerged hours later, near dawn, through a forgotten drainage hatch a mile from the estate, in a quiet, wooded area bordering Monaco. Elias had shed his bloody suit jacket, looking like a simple, weary man in a white dress shirt and dark trousers. Elias quickly arranged for a trusted, low-level associate, someone who didn't know the politics of the coup, to drive them to a remote, empty house in the countryside of France. Inside the small, unassuming safe house, Elena cleaned and bandaged his wound properly. The immediate danger was past, but the existential dread remained. "Victor will go straight to Kresnik," Elias predicted grimly, sitting on the hard edge of the bed. "He'll offer the location of Stavros, the witness, in exchange for Kresnik backing him as the new boss. Stavros is the key to proving the truth of the Milan incident, the only man who knows who saved you." He looked at Elena, his face haunted. "We should still run. We take the new papers. We disappear. Redemption is not possible for men like me, Elena. I've done too much." Elena knelt beside him, looking into his eyes. She saw the boy who had witnessed the fire, not the monster who had profited from it. "Redemption isn't a reward, Elias, it's a choice," she replied gently. "You stopped the hit on Stavros. You confessed the truth of the scar. You lost your empire because you chose me, the victim, over Victor, the loyal killer." She placed a hand on his knee, a small, comforting pressure. "If we run, Kresnik wins. He gets the empire and he gets to kill Stavros. We have to beat Kresnik to Stavros." And then, Elena looked down at the floor, the full weight of her decision settling over her. "We use the truth. I use the truth. I may have lost Serafina Hayes and my old life, but I found Elena Rossi, and she is strong enough to ask for justice." Elias finally allowed himself a tiny, profound breath. He felt the crushing weight of his life begin to lift, replaced by the terrifying lightness of a future without a lie. The path forward was violent, dangerous, and likely suicidal, but for the first time in 20 years, it was clean. "Stavros is currently in a safe house outside of Geneva, Switzerland," Elias informed her, his voice regaining some of its old authority, but laced with a new kind of resolution. "He's guarded by loyal men, but Kresnik's team is closer. They were going to confront the truth head-on. They were going to save the witness, expose the lie, and sacrifice Elias's world in the process." The morning sun streamed through the window of the simple French house, falling on Elena's face. She was bruised, exhausted, and her life was wreckage, but her warm hazel eyes held a fierce, unwavering light. She was ready. Elias saw the sun reflecting off her mahogany skin and the scar that held the map to their destruction. He had lost his control, his right-hand man, and possibly his life. But he had gained a chance to be human again. It was a hauntingly bittersweet end to the night. They had survived the betrayal, but their reckoning was only just beginning. They had nothing left but the truth, and the choice to use it. What an incredible journey. The story of Elias and Elena, the monster and the consequence, has reached its powerful and well-earned conclusion. Elena found her truth, and Elias, in losing his empire, finally found his humanity. If you were hooked from that very first moment in the rain, when Elias collapsed in shame, all the way to this final, bittersweet reckoning, please do 3 things for us. Hit the subscribe button. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next epic story we drop. Give this video a thumbs up. A huge thank you for sticking with us through every chapter. A like helps this story travel farther across the world. Leave a final comment. We want to know your final thoughts. What was the most heartbreaking or shocking moment for you in the entire series? And let us know what city and country you're watching from. And remember, the full playlist for The Boss's Secret Scar is linked below. If you know someone who needs a truly binge-worthy story, share the link with them. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next story.